I want you to think of a dream. A happy dream, a really happy dream, like standing out on a cold January day in Albany looking out over thousands of people cheering your recent success. A dream like that, for example. Or a new Nobel Prize for someone inventing every new idea for social organization granted to you in a grand celebration, a dream. Or a dream of a month when we're not reminded through the news of just how unfair and how unjust a society we have allowed to become. Imagine that dream. And then imagine a nagging soul who appears at the corner of the dream and tells you, you know, this is a dream, right? Just a dream. But you resist it, you fight those words, you know they're true, but you don't want to believe them because this dream is just too damn good and you want it. You want just for a few moments to believe something could be just that good. Because what I want to remind you of here is that we have entered a place where we come every 4 years or so, entered a place where we as a people, we as a party, even we as this wing of the Democratic Party, we enter a dream. Every 4 years or so, maybe for a year, maybe for 18 months if we're lucky, we enter a dream where politicians on the left, and for those on the right, politicians on the right, tell us how things are going to be. They promise us how wonderful things will be when if they can only win. They talk about jobs, about protecting Social Security. They promise real healthcare reform, clean air, clean water, a safe and healthy food system, climate change legislation. They remind us of a time when CEOs didn't make 324 times the average salary of the average worker. They take us back to a time when schools, public schools, were great. And when middle-class jobs were not a guarantee of an even lower middle-class job for your child. They take us to a time of George Bailey's banks, when trust and bank were basically the same idea, when the only men who spoke of doing God's work were people doing God's work, not people working for boards of large multinational corporations. They take us back to a time. And let us imagine and dream of the slogans about this nation that have resonated, that seemed obvious, that were not fantasies of perfect justice, but a constant struggle for perfect justice, of a time when there was a struggle for a more perfect justice, a time when the slogans didn't seem obvious, of a time when the system is rigged didn't seem so obvious as to be trite. We've entered that time. And I'm the nagging soul here to say to you, you know this is a dream, right? You know this is a dream. It's a dream that we have these hopes because they will be stopped. This dream will stop. We will wake up and come back to the reality of just what can't be done because of the simple truth of this simple slogan that is almost too obvious to be named. The system is rigged. The system is rigged. Rigged. What does that mean? African Americans understood what rigged meant. 1923, Texas passed a law. By law, Texas said the only people who could vote in the Democratic primary were white people. Only white people could vote. So in the Texas system, 84% of Texas could vote in principle in the Democratic primary. And after they made their choice, then in theory at least 100% could participate in the general election. So 16% were excluded in this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to whites only. That was rigged. Rigged. Or the kids in Hong Kong. They understand rigged. Last August, Hong Kong was told by the Chinese government that there would be a law for selecting their governor. The law said the ultimate aim is the selection of a chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. That committee would be 1,200 citizens, which out of a population of 7 million meant about 0.02%. That's a really tiny number. Look, see how small that number is. And if we thought about how we might represent that number, if we put all the people in Hong Kong together, we put them onto a map, here's what 1,000, 1,200 people look like, that tiny, tiny corner, which, as the protesters recognized, would be a corner dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. This picture, 0.02%, selecting the candidates that the rest of the people got to vote on, where 99.98% were excluded in that critical first step, would produce this consequence, obviously, of a democracy responsive to China only. That was a system that was rigged. It was rigged even though, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, even though the people in all of those systems have the ultimate influence over the elected officials, yeah, ultimate maybe, but just because they have the ultimate influence does not mean the system is not rigged, because rigging is its purpose. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that's its purpose? Well, I know it because I'm a student of the great Cherry Street philosopher, Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, who explained long before the Texans figured out how legally to exclude blacks, long before Hong Kong figured out how to exclude most of the citizens from Hong Kong, long before Boss Tweed said, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. This was the conception. A conception of a democracy. This is how rigging was done. This is how rigging is still done. Because think about democracy in America. We take it for granted in America that campaigns will be privately funded. Funding, though, is its own contest. Funding is its own primary. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to power, to get their party back into power. And as they do this, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is a picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance their campaigns need to survive. In this process, they're living life in a primary, a money primary. It's not the white primary, it's a green primary. It's the first stage in a multi-stage election. It is the stage that determines who is qualified, who is plausible, who is the respectable candidates who get to run in an election. And in that process, the funders are key. So in 2014, we know 5.4 million Americans gave at least $1 to any congressional campaign, which means if you thought about them, you'd say that the funders here were less than 2%. But the people who gave $20, you wouldn't think of them as mattering much in the system, so we could think about the biggest funders. Politico tells us the top 100 funders gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million funders. So if those were the relevant people, you'd say that's 0.00027% of the population dominating this first stage that we then get to respond to in the second. But I like to think about the relevant funders, the people who give enough so that their views matter, so that people think about them as they're dialing for dollars, as they think about what positions they need to take to make sure they keep them on their side. So here's an arbitrary cutoff. Let's say $5,200, which is the maximum amount you can give one candidate in the course of 2 election cycles, $5,200. Turns out, in 2014, 57,874 Americans gave a total of $5,200. For those of you doing the numbers, what you know is 57,874 Americans is exactly 0.02% of America. 0.02%, dominating this first stage, setting the standards for the candidates who we get to select in the second stage. We should give this a name. This should be called tweedism. Tweedism. A tiny fraction, we could say a Chinese fraction, dominating this first stage with the rest of us excluded in this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of a democracy responsive to these funders only. Study at Princeton, which we're not allowed to talk about Princeton studies, so we put it off the stage quickly, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page. The largest empirical study of actual policy decisions by our government in the history of political science, relating them to the views of the economic elite, organized interest groups, and the average voter. So for the economic elite, this is what they find. As you go from 0% of the elite supporting an idea to 100% of the economic elite supporting the idea, the probability of that idea becoming law goes up. Here's for the organized interest groups. As the number of interest groups supporting an idea goes from a small number to a large number, the probability of the ideas which those groups support getting enacted goes up. It's an obvious, intuitive relationship. That's the thing you would expect democracy to do. Here's the picture of the average citizen's preference. That's a flat line, metaphorically and literally, a flat line. What that says is it doesn't matter. The percentage of average voters who want something, it has no effect on the probability of that thing becoming enacted. As they put in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy, right? In a democracy. This is supposed to be the picture of a democracy. We're supposed to be sitting there. This is kind of middle America. That's weird. There we are in the middle of the sitting there steering the bus. This is the idea. Yet here is the reality. The wheel has become removed from the wheels of the bus. Rigged has a name in America. Its name is tweedism. Okay, now there are some who look at this picture and they say, you know, we've got a campaign finance problem here. This picture looks to them like this, a campaign finance problem. Those are the sort of people who look at this picture and say, oh, we've got an altitude problem. Or who look at this and say, oh, the Titanic has a course problem. Or this alcoholic has a liquid intake problem. Because when I hear people talk about this problem as a campaign finance problem, I literally don't know what they're trying to say. What are they trying to say? If we agree on nothing tonight, let us at least agree on this, that America doesn't have a campaign finance problem. It doesn't have a disclosure problem. What America has is a representative democracy problem. We have a system that distorts fundamentally the representative democracy, or more fundamentally, this is it. This is what America has. America has an equality problem. We are unequal citizens because that is what tweedism is. It is inequality made manifest. Now, I don't mean wealth inequality, though of course it produces that too. And I don't mean race inequality, though of course it trades on that inequality too. And I don't mean sex inequality, though of course women have a much harder time in this system competing because they don't have the resources that men do in our political system. I don't mean those kinds of inequality. I mean an inequality that was central to our framers' design, but we have completely forgotten, the equality we should call citizen equality. Citizen inequality. Because what tweedism breeds is unequal citizens. Unequal citizens in the political process, a democracy-destroying inequality. So if we do nothing else tonight, let us at least do this. Let us at least banish this campaign finance nerd talk. When we're talking about what's wrong with America's democracy today, let's embrace this moral talk. Let's embrace the talk of the immorality that is this inequality. Because the truth is, until we address this inequality, nothing real will be done by our government. Nothing, regardless of the issue that concerns you, climate change or healthcare or financial reform or student debts or economic equality, regardless of the issue, nothing gets fixed in this fantasy policy land until we fix this underlying inequality. We have to find a way. We have to find a way to make it central, to make this inequality central. We have to find a way to make citizens' equality central to this political debate. That's our challenge. It is a moral challenge, not a nerd's challenge. It's about achieving, finally, a central promise of a republic, of a representative democracy. But the truth is, it won't be easy to make this issue central. Conventional wisdom, this is kind of cute, girl blogger came up with this idea. Get it? It's like there's a convention name tag, it's named wisdom, so there it is. Conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is people don't care about this issue. They don't care about this issue. I mean, not no one. There's, of course, the postman who tried to deliver a message to Congress about this issue. There's Doris Haddock, AKA Granny D, who walked 3,200 miles at the age of 90 for this issue, which I'm going to airbrush a little bit and say it wasn't campaign finance reform, it was equality she was walking for. There are the literally 500 people who've walked across New Hampshire in the middle of January to raise the awareness around this issue in that critical primary state. It's not that there are none, there are some talking about this issue. But the point is, to the press, to the public, to the world inside the Beltway, it doesn't seem like enough. It doesn't seem like a lot, it doesn't seem like enough. Even though in polls commissioned by the Run, Warren, Run campaign, 94% of Americans agree the system is rigged. And even though in a poll we ran last year, we found 96% of Americans, so there are some Republicans in that too, right? 96% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money. Still, it's conventional wisdom to write things like this, quoting a political consultant without noting how odd it is to be quoting a political consultant about something like this. It's a zero issue. No one cares. They shrug. They already believe that all politicians are corrupt assholes. It's baked in the cake. They get it. Okay, but I think this analysis moves too quickly. I think it misses something important. In the poll that found 96% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money in politics, the very next question we asked was, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? And we found 91% did not believe it likely. So, just like at least 96% of us wish we could fly like Superman, but because 91% of us are pretty convinced we don't leap off of tall buildings regularly. This is what maturity is, accepting the world you have found yourself in. This is not apathy. This is not no one cares. This is the politics of resignation. We accept that there's nothing we can do. We have amended Ben Franklin's "Nothing is certain but death and taxes" to add "and a corrupt government." And of course, our confidence that there's nothing we can do was only made worse by the efforts of our friends almost 8 years ago. Change we can believe in. When we hear this message again and again, we begin to see who we are in this story. Here's who we are. As we recognize that again and again, we will be challenged, we will be promised, and we will be disappointed. Now, this sets up a really important problem, but it's the reason, I think, to be for Warren in this campaign. But we have to start with an obvious point. To be pro-Warren is not to be anti-Clinton. It doesn't follow one from the other. And in my family, in my corner, there's enormous respect and admiration for Hillary Clinton for a very long time. In 1992, before some of you were even born, let's say, my uncle, this incredible man, Dick Cates, who had been a lawyer, one of the chief lawyers prosecuting Nixon, was visiting, and I said to him in 1992, "So what do you think of Clinton?" And he said to me, "I think she's amazing." I thought, okay, maybe you're losing it, Dick. I said, "She? What are you talking about?" And of course, what I hadn't known at that point was that Hillary was one of my uncle's first employees, a person working for him in prosecuting the case against Nixon, and what he believed became the reigning orthodox that she was extraordinary and that she would be the extraordinary president that would come out of that family. And the truth is, as you think about someone who's been on the national stage as she has for the last 25 years, it's hard not to conclude that no one is better prepared for this job than she is. And when you think of the Job-like existence she's had over those last 25 years, with the insane right-wing wing nuts, and frankly, the incredible sexism of the last political campaign, she is someone who has earned in every sense, I think, of the term, the right to be considered the leading candidate. And in an ordinary time, I think she is the obvious choice for everything she has done and is and could be as a president. But this is not an ordinary time. And the biggest challenge of this time is not about the candidates. The biggest challenge in this time is about us. The biggest challenge in this time is the skepticism and cynicism and resignation of us, the belief that we have that there's nothing we can do, the way we've amended this frame to be none can be believed in, there is no change to believe in, that paralyzes us, that makes us step back from the idea that we could actually rally a public to do something worthwhile. Claris did a poll a couple years ago where they found 80% of Americans look at every single reform that's been passed by Congress and believe that it's been designed more to help current members of Congress get reelected than to improve the system. A deep cynicism even about the reformers. So in my view, the question here is not just what's right or what change do we need. The critical question is also, how do we make that credible? Who would be believed as the person who could bring about this change? This is not about just clicking off ideas on a sheet of policy plans. It's about who could pierce the veil of cynicism that defines who we've become. And for all the great things that Elisabeth Warren is, and as a colleague of hers and as someone who has known her for at least 10 years, there are an extraordinary range of advantages that she has, including the ones that Zephyr talked about at the beginning. But of all the advantages she has, this is Warren's advantage. This is Warren's advantage because even her enemies believe her. Even her enemies, whether deserved or not, and I think it's deserved, see her as a powerful person standing up as a voice against the powerful. Because in a constant series of choices that have defined her career, she has pushed for right against the rich. And in this almost weird FDR-esque way, she has this eagerness to demonstrate she can stand up to the most powerful, that she loves to stand up to the most powerful. Now, with Roosevelt, you can understand it, a rich man rising to the top, wanting to express his power by standing up to the most powerful. But imagine someone like Warren, who starts not at the top, but at the very bottom, coming to the place where she has the confidence of her convictions enough to look power straight in the eyes and say no. This is who she is. And this is who she is seen to be. Not just because of what she has said, but because of what she has done again and again across her career. The reality is, this is her brand. It is how we understand her, the person who can do this, and not just we. Not just the small circle of politically engaged people who are constantly playing this horse race to figure out whose polls tell us who's actually going to win. Not us, because we don't matter in this fight. It is the people outside of this circle of politically active people who understand her as this, who understand her as the person willing to stand up and to push credibly, because she thinks it's right. If anyone could convince us, it is she. It is she who could convince us. And convincing us of the possibility that a leader could do what every leader has failed to do for the past 40 years, I think, is everything in this fight. The system is rigged. We get it. 94% agree. And we recognize we must unrig it. But the reality of candidate Warren is that the constant fight that her candidacy would be is a constant story of why and how that rigging can be undone. And the inspiration that conversation, that debate, that engagement by serious, intelligent, powerful women would give the inspiration to the hopelessness that now defines this field. I make one more reflection before I stop. When I was 3 days old, not 3 years old, Martin Luther King went to Lincoln University and gave this speech. And in this speech, he said, "America is essentially a dream. The substance of the dream is expressed in these sublime words lifted to cosmic proportion, that all men are created equal. A dream." Now, no doubt when those words were first drafted in a declaration, there were many African Americans across America who looked at that dream and said it's a fantasy. But King didn't believe it was a fantasy, because King could step back and see the history of America as the history of that dream becoming reality. He could see a nation founded with a promise not kept, a promise for equality, and he could see that basically every 50 years, the nation returned to this fight for equality. The revolution itself was originally a fight against second-class citizens. That's the original Tea Party movement. The Jefferson and Jacksonians were a fight to restore the promise of a democracy against an emerging aristocracy. The Civil War started for the Union, ended as a fight to restore an equality, to establish the possibility of African Americans in this democracy. The progressives were fundamentally about achieving a democracy that could make the power of all of us relevant in an age governed by the gilded. And then the Civil Rights Movement, which was a movement to deliver finally 400 years later on the promise of an equal justice for people created equally. I think if we're to find strength in this movement, if we're to find inspiration, if we're to understand our work, we should find it in that last struggle for equality, the struggle we celebrate just 50 years ago. The the struggle for which Jimmy Lee Jackson died, the struggle which led him then to inspire the march that was to be from Selma to Montgomery, the march that then inspired the march and the passion that led to an incredible brutality and blood spilled across the television sets around the world to lead and rally a nation, including the president, to step up and demand finally this equality. These were people fighting for equality, for the equal right to vote. They didn't have the vote. They didn't have an equal vote. So they walked and they protested and they fought for that equality. But here's what we must recognize. We don't have the vote either. We don't have an equal vote. Not in the ballot election, but in the money election. Not in a general election, but in the green primary. And what we must do is that we must walk, we must protest, we must fight for this equality. An equality. And in this fight, there is nothing that we need to do now that will be as hard as what they did then. There will be no fire hoses, there will be no German shepherds, there will be no indignity, there will be no death. There is nothing as hard as what they did. Nothing that hard. There will be a sacrifice, but not that much. I was reminded of this incredible sacrifice when I recognized that when King became a public figure, he was just 26 years old. That's the age when Aaron left the world. King became the public figure. And for the next 13 years of his life, he lived out of a suitcase as he went across the country, attempting to rally America to this ideal of equality until he was murdered in April in 1968 in Memphis. No one's asking for that much. The most we're asking for here is not 13 years, it's 13 months. 13 months of a campaign. To unite not a divided house, but to lead a united people, because we all start with the conclusion of this campaign that this system is rigged, and to give these united people hope. To imagine really citizens united in this ideal of a citizen equality. It's not that hard, but it's true. It's true. Because as we remember the blood and the pain and the sacrifice, we remember it not so much because we must suffer the same for this fight, but because of what motivated them, what recognition motivated them. As King put it, the fierce urgency of now. It is as fierce for us as it was for them. Because this cannot wait, this fight. We cannot wait for a government that works. We cannot wait for a government that can address the most fundamental problems that our nation faces. We cannot wait. We cannot wait because we love our children. We cannot wait because we love our country. We cannot let this fail. We cannot let this fail. Now. When people tell you this is a fight for campaign finance reform, tell them they are wrong. It's a fight for citizen equality. When they say all we need is a little bit of transparency in the system, tell them they are wrong. What we need is citizen equality. When they imagine that it's just a Supreme Court case that made this all so bad, tell them they are wrong. What happened on January 20th, 2010 was not the last day of a great democracy. What happened on January 20th, 2010, the day before Citizens United was decided, was a democracy that was already dead, having its cold body shot by a Supreme Court that didn't even recognize that the democracy was already dead. You need to tell them You need to tell them what this fight is about. We need to tell them what this fight is about. It's not a fight against a court. It's a fight for equality. It's not to help campaign finance bean counters get their calculations right. It's a fight for equality. It's not a fight among policy wonks. It's a fight for equality. Not an inequality suffered by 15% of the public. It's an inequality suffered by 99% of the public. And 50 years after the Voting Rights Act, which fought for the 15%, we need to have a Voting Rights Act that fights for the 99% who are excluded from this republic because their votes don't count the same. 50 years after the fight, we need to remember all that they gave and to give a fraction of that back. A fraction of that back. And if we do, then we win. We win this fight. 50 years ago tomorrow, in New York City, Martin Luther King gave a speech to the New York City bar. And as he described segregation, and he described the system that had been allowed even 10 years after the declaration by the Supreme Court that segregation was over, he modified his speech in his writing, in his hand, to say, this is difference made legal. This is difference made legal. This reality is difference made legal. For us, this reality is as much a denial for equality in this one critical space of public democracy. This is difference made legal. And what we urgently need now is a debate and a fight and a movement that addresses that inequality. And what that movement needs is a leader, and her name is Elisabeth. Thank you very much.